What are the realistic worst-case scenarios for the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan in, say, 2025?
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, what might they actually mean for you?
It's a huge question, and it definitely pulls us into a region that's, well, often in the headlines.
Right. But today we want to go a bit beyond the sort of day-to-day news cycle. We want to understand the potential futures that expert analysis suggests could unfold.
Exactly. The India-Pakistan relationship, it's obviously got a long, very intricate history. But our focus today isn't really the history books.
Yeah.
It's more a look at 4 distinct escalations that, recent in-depth analysis has identified as plausible in the near term.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And just to be clear, we're not here to amplify fears or pick sides, not at all.
No.
The goal is to really dig into how these situations could develop based on the analysis and what the wider consequences might be.
And it's all drawn from careful consideration of, current trends, developments, but also those longer-term historical patterns.
Okay, good. So let's unpack the first scenario. It's one that, sadly, isn't entirely unfamiliar. A full-scale conventional war.
Right. So imagine a significant ratcheting up of the kinds of skirmishes and airstrikes we've sometimes seen along the line of control. A major escalation from that baseline.
And what could trigger something like that, according to the analysis?
Well, analysts point to a couple of main possibilities. One could be another really large-scale terror attack inside India, which is then attributed, rightly or wrongly, to groups based in Pakistan.
Okay.
Another potential catalyst could be a preemptive military move. By either side, really, if they felt a major threat was imminent.
And the fallout from a conventional war like that?
Yeah.
The analysis suggests it would be immense.
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about potentially very high numbers of casualties, both military and, tragically, civilian.
Huge human cost.
Indeed. And then beyond the immediate loss of life, you have to consider the impact on infrastructure.
Right. Where would that hit hardest?
Well, regions like Jammu and Kashmir, obviously, Punjab too, these border areas would likely suffer, significant damage.
And that damage, it doesn't just stay physical, does it?
No, it has this cascading effect. It would almost certainly disrupt local economies, regional economies, hit trade routes hard, big economic consequences.
And presumably it wouldn't stay confined just to India and Pakistan.
Unlikely. The analysis indicates you'd probably see strong global condemnation, pretty swift involvement from the UN Security Council trying to de-escalate.
And what about the nuclear question in this scenario?
That's the ever-present shadow, isn't it? Experts seem to think a deliberate nuclear exchange might still be avoided in a purely conventional war scenario.
Okay, that's something.
But, and this is crucial, the analysis suggests alert levels for nuclear forces on both sides would almost certainly be raised. Heightened alert.
Which itself is incredibly dangerous.
It inherently increases the danger. Risk of miscalculation, misinterpretation, maybe an accidental escalation that neither side actually wants. A very tense situation.
That is a chilling prospect. Okay, let's turn to an even more alarming possibility outlined in the analysis. A tactical nuclear exchange.
Right. This is where things get significantly darker.
This is where one side perceives, an existential threat.
Exactly. The analysis suggests this isn't about winning territory, it's about survival. Feeling like your back is completely against the wall.
What kind of specific circumstances are we talking about here? What are the potential triggers?
So the analysis highlights scenarios like maybe the encirclement of major military formations or the loss of strategically critical territory, something seen as absolutely vital.
And in that kind of extreme desperation.
And those extreme circumstances, the analysis presents the use of smaller, so-called tactical nuclear weapons against military targets as a truly devastating but potential last resort.
The immediate aftermath of that, it's almost beyond comprehension.
It is. You're looking at potentially tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of immediate deaths, just boom.
And that's just the immediate.
That's just the immediate. Then you have the long-lasting, insidious effects of radiation exposure for survivors and the environment.
A nightmare scenario.
Truly. The analysis paints a very grim picture. An environmental and humanitarian disaster basically engulfing South Asia.
And the global reaction.
You'd expect global financial markets to react severely, a potential crash, international sanctions levied almost immediately.
And people would flee.
Immense numbers, massive refugee crises, both internally within the countries and potentially spilling across borders. Huge displacement.
And the analysis mentions outside intervention becoming more likely here.
Yes, given the sheer scale and the global implications of using nuclear weapons, even tactical ones, it could compel major powers, perhaps NATO, maybe China, to consider diplomatic or even potentially military intervention.
The ramifications just spread outwards globally.
Absolutely. It wouldn't be a regional issue anymore.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. There's another scenario explored, which is less state-on-state war initially and more about internal conflict amplified from the outside.
Right. This is the idea of a Kashmir intifada, like a major uprising, combined with a surge in proxy warfare.
So how does that unfold in the analysis?
It envisions a significant internal uprising within Indian-administered Kashmir, something that really gains traction and is then amplified, sustained, maybe equipped by non-state actors who have support or sanctuary in Pakistan.
What could trigger that kind of intense uprising?
The analysis suggests potential triggers like maybe large-scale arrests by security forces or prolonged, really strict curfews that cripple daily life, or perhaps a military response in the valley that's seen as overly harsh or indiscriminate.
So the consequences here are different from the first two scenarios, less about conventional battle lines.
Precisely. It's less about tank battles and more about a prolonged grounding insurgency. Sustained armed resistance, perhaps involving civilians within Kashmir.
And potentially spilling over.
It could well lead to an increase in terrorist activities targeting urban centers across India. That's a stated concern in the analysis.
And wider regional stability.
That's another major concern, the potential for destabilization to ripple outwards, possibly affecting Afghanistan, maybe even parts of Central Asia. And it could strengthen extremist groups across the board, potentially weakening state control in certain fragile areas.
The recipe for long-term instability.
Definitely. A very messy, protracted conflict scenario.
Okay, that brings us to the fourth potential worst-case scenario looked at in the analysis. This one revolves around a vital shared resource. Water.
Yes, the water war scenario. This one's particularly interesting, I think, because it centers on the Indus Waters Treaty.
Which has been in place for decades, managing river sharing.
Exactly. It's been relatively durable despite tensions. But this scenario explores what happens if India were to, say, unilaterally suspend the treaty.
How might that happen?
Perhaps by constructing major dams or water diversion projects on crucial shared rivers like the Chenab or Kalam or Indus tributaries without Pakistani consent, effectively cutting off downstream flows significantly.
And Pakistan's reaction.
The analysis suggests Pakistan might interpret such a move as an existential threat in itself, an act of aggression targeting its lifeline, essentially, and could potentially respond militarily.
A military response to water infrastructure. That's a stark thought.
It is. The analysis points to the possibility of targeted attacks, maybe airstrikes or special forces operations, aimed specifically at that dam infrastructure in India.
Wow. And the consequences for Pakistan if the water is cut off, even temporarily.
Catastrophic. Potentially widespread agricultural collapse in parts of Punjab and Sindh, which are Pakistan's breadbasket.
Leading to
Severe food shortages, food insecurity, mass displacement of rural populations whose livelihoods depend on that water, and likely significant civil unrest internally within Pakistan as a result.
And the international community.
You'd expect enormous international pressure, particularly on India, to resume compliance with the treaty. Water security is a major global concern.
Okay, so we've looked at these four pretty distinct and frankly quite concerning potential futures from the analysis. What are some of the overarching strategic implications that stand out?
Well, one really key takeaway across multiple scenarios, especially the first two, is the absolutely critical role of international mediation.
Getting others involved quickly.
Yes. The analysis underscores that swift, effective diplomacy by third parties, the UN, maybe key powers like China, Iran, the US, could be absolutely essential. Essential in preventing that slide towards full-scale conventional war, or, even more critically, stopping an escalation to tactical nuclear use. Diplomacy is key.
And the analysis also mentions conflict potentially moving beyond the traditional battlefield.
That's right. It highlights that in our totally interconnected world, any major conflict between India and Pakistan probably wouldn't be limited to just land, air, and sea.
You mean cyber and space?
Exactly. Imagine attacks targeting critical satellite systems used for communication, navigation, intelligence, or cyber attacks aimed at financial networks, power grids, command and control systems.
That could be devastating in parallel to physical conflict.
Absolutely. The analysis suggests these could very well be features of any future large-scale conflict between them, adding another layer of complexity and potential damage.
And running through all of this is the human cost. We touched on casualties, but the broader humanitarian picture.
It's a massive concern. The analysis really highlights the potential need for emergency aid for millions, not just in the immediate conflict zones like Kashmir or Punjab, but potentially impacting vast populations across Sindh in Pakistan, and even radiating outwards towards major population centers like Delhi and Lahore, depending on the scenario's scale.
A potential humanitarian crisis on a huge scale.
A major, major concern.
Okay, now the analysis also introduces a specific framework, something called the She-Wolf Strategy Matrix. Let's try and understand this. It seems like a tool for thinking about these different outcomes.
Precisely. It's basically a way to categorize these potential events, these scenarios we've discussed, based on two simple but crucial factors. How likely is it to happen? That's probability. And how bad would it be if it did happen? That's impact.
Okay, probability and impact.
Yeah. And by plotting these possibilities onto a 4-quadrant grid, it helps decision makers, analysts, whoever, think about what kind of actions might be most appropriate for each type of risk.
Right, makes sense. Let's walk through those quadrants then. The analysis puts them in colors. Top left, in red, is labeled activate. That's high probability, high impact. What fits there?
So, according to the analysis using this matrix, this is where you'd place things like a full-scale conventional war breaking out, or maybe major cyber attacks causing widespread disruption, or significant sustained military incursions across the line of control. Things likely to happen and with severe consequences.
And the activate suggests the response needs to be immediate and significant.
Exactly. The suggested actions are large-scale. Full mobilization of military and civil defense resources, potentially implementing wartime economic protocols, and engaging in urgent high-level diplomacy through bodies like the UN Security Council, or maybe groupings like the Quad, basically crisis mode.
Okay. Then moving across, top right, in yellow, is adepti.
Oh.
This is high probability but lower impact. What falls here?
This quadrant in the analysis includes things like the more routine, sadly localized border skirmishes, or perhaps a manageable refugee influx from a smaller flare-up, or disruptions to bilateral trade that aren't catastrophic. Things that are quite likely but don't threaten national survival.
So the response is more flexible. Adapt.
Yeah, the recommended actions here are more about agility and targeted responses. Deploying rapid reaction teams, maybe, setting up humanitarian relief corridors if needed, using informal diplomatic channels, what's often called track-to diplomacy, using non-governmental experts or former officials to manage the situation without over-escalating.
Got it. Okay. Dropping down, bottom left, in orange, is anticipate. Now this is low probability but high impact. The dangerous outliers.
Exactly. This quadrant holds those really severe, potentially catastrophic possibilities that hopefully won't happen, but you absolutely have to prepare for.
Like the nuclear scenario.
Precisely. The analysis places the use of tactical nuclear weapons firmly here. Also, that Indus water war scenario we discussed, or maybe a truly major 9/11 scale terror attack. Low probability, but devastating if they occur.
So anticipate means being ready just in case.
That's the idea. The suggested actions focus heavily on preparedness, conducting regular civil defense drills, enhancing surveillance like satellite monitoring of military movements or water infrastructure, and crucially, putting in place robust multi-sector contingency plans. Plans to ensure essential services, government functions can continue even in a massive crisis.
Makes sense. Finally, bottom right in green is avoid. Low probability, low impact. What's left for this one?
This covers the lower level, less dangerous scenarios. Things like propaganda campaigns being waged online or through media, or perhaps very minor isolated violations of ceasefire agreements along the low sea that don't escalate.
Things you want to stop, but aren't immediate crises.
Right. So the recommended responses in the avoid category are relatively low-key. Things like promoting media literacy to counter propaganda, general de-escalation efforts, improving border intelligence to get early warnings, and maybe using subtle diplomatic signals to communicate resolve without raising tensions unnecessarily, keeping things calm.
Okay, that matrix is actually quite a useful way to frame the different levels of risk and response. So just to kind of recap our whole discussion, we've really dug into 4 potential worst-case scenarios for India-Pakistan relations in the near future, based on this recent analysis.
Yeah, the full-scale conventional war, the nightmare of a tactical nuclear exchange, that destabilizing Kashmir intifada amplified by proxy warfare, and the potential conflict triggered by a major water dispute over the Indus.
And across these, we've seen how vital international diplomacy and mediation could be, especially in averting those highest impact scenarios.
Absolutely critical. And it's also crucial, as the analysis points out, to remember these conflicts could easily spill into other domains space, cyber making them even more complex.
Plus, the immense humanitarian challenges that loom over almost all of these scenarios. That can't be overstated.
Not at all. The potential human cost is staggering.
Looking at these potential futures, even though they are worst-case scenarios from the analysis, it really does highlight the delicate balance of peace, not just in the region, but globally.
It really brings home how interconnected our world is, doesn't it? How conflict in one area can have significant economic, political, human repercussions that spread far beyond the immediate borders.
Absolutely. Which leads to maybe a final thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over perhaps.
Yeah, given these potential futures laid out in the analysis, what is the role? What's the responsibility of the broader international community? What levers can international cooperation and diplomacy actually pull to effectively de-escalate these incredibly high-stakes situations?
And ultimately prevent the worst from unfolding.
Exactly. It's a really complex web of international relations, security concerns, national interests. And answering that question means thinking about the actions and motivations of many, many different players on the global stage. Something to definitely keep thinking about.